Hi there, Michael here. On this channel, I sometimes interview people who already made a mark on the immersive audio industry. This may be through creating a well-established immersive audio technology, such as when I talked to Yannick Greve from the Fraunhofer Institute about MPEG-H, or when I had a conversation with two-times Grammy-nominated immersive audio producer and creator of the highly respected spatial audio designer, Tom Ammerman. What I have not yet done, however, is talk to up-and-coming people. Those innovators who have fresh and highly unconventional ideas that have the potential to shape immersive audio technology in the future. Over the next couple of weeks, I will therefore publish a couple of interviews with such up-and-coming artists and makers in the field of immersive audio. These are innovators that have not yet established themselves, but who are well on their way to becoming a household name in the future. And I'm kicking this series off with a chat with Patrick Krisny, founder of Slovox and inventor and maker of the Singing Watermelons, a highly innovative family of immersive audio instruments that utilizes beamforming technology in order to integrate immersive sound into architectural designs. Patrick is an absolutely fascinating person who combines artistic vision with a deep technological understanding, and I'm sure that you will enjoy his insights. But enough said, let's turn it over to Patrick. Today I'm talking to Patrick Krisny, founder of a very innovative company called Slovox. I became aware of Patrick through his article he wrote on Sounding Futures, in which he described his Singing Watermelons. And I'm going to leave a link to that article in the description below. I think it is a highly interesting read for anybody interested in immersive audio. But before we get into why the watermelons are actually singing, let's start with a brief introduction, because many of my viewers might not be aware of Patrick or Slovox. So Patrick, in a nutshell, who are you and what do you do?
I'm the watermelon man, apparently. Seriously, you probably haven't heard, not many people probably have heard about it in spatial audio, about me in spatial audio, because I'm kind of a newcomer to spatial audio industry. Myself, I've been always in running creative companies since the early 2000s, usually revolving around visuals and quite a lot of technological innovation around visuals, crazy cinematography, time-lapse. I was a co-founder of Dido Gear, which was a camera equipment company, where we did motion-controlled time-lapse equipment. So quite a sophisticated thing back then. It was around 2010. And that was one of not so many endeavors that I did on the tech side, meaning on the hardware side. And a couple of years ago, I retired from visuals. I've achieved everything that I wanted, and also the industry changed a lot. And looking for other areas for innovation, I realized that there is this saying that in film, something like 50% of the final effect is sound. I wouldn't agree with that across my entire career. Now, probably I think it's even more important. So kind of a personal development. But anyways, I got into spatial audio, and I heard about the Echo and the development of Franz Zotter at IEM and his entire team across the years. And about a year ago, in spring actually, I did a trip to Berlin because I wanted to compare a large chunk of spatial audio systems next to each other. So I booked a bunch of meetings and got a good review, listening to every one of them in a row in a very close time. And actually, there were only two things which were convincing to me. One of them was 4D sound technology, the guys from Netherlands in Monum, and the other one was Echo. And I got so hooked on this that I essentially thought, okay, I want to build one for myself, and that's how it started.
That's very interesting. I mean, first of all, I work in an environment where we have a lot of people in cinema, and they would usually tell you that essentially it's more than 50%. Audio actually kind of makes up more than 50%. It's actually most of the experience, really, to some extent, or kind of a large percentage of the experience. So that's actually quite interesting. You kind of described at some point your kind of move from the visual world to the spatial sound world as a conscious decision to leave a colonized field. And what exactly do you mean by that? And what exactly was this catalyst to kind of make that move?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm so glad you picked it up somewhere. Yeah, well, I'm a philosophical kind of guy doing a lot of thinking and sense making out of what's happening in the world. And, I've been seeing, like, let me put it this way. Around 2000s, like I was late to the game, but this was still the time where it was happening. Me and pretty much everybody in the design industry, we were fighting for making design have a seat at the table, to put it that way, right? Apple was probably the only one company doing nice designerish things, and design was not there yet. Like there were people designing, but there was still a lot to do to make design an established and respected field. And what happened over the years was that I saw design, going up to its peak, and then something started to change because design started being weaponized. And by weaponization of design, I mean that it's not only graphic design, it's not only visual design. I'm talking broadly about it. It's like people started using the principles of design in bad faith. To give you a few examples, like right now you open any social media app and there are, these apps are a result of hundreds of people, well-paid designers, trying to design better tools to grab your attention and hold it for longer and mislead you and, just lead you the way which is absolutely not in line with your interests and your goals. It's only in line with their financial goals. So that's one of the examples, but perhaps one of the most prominent of how design is being weaponized these days. And I think this broadly or loosely answers the question of colonization, right? This is one of the aspects, but at the same time, visuals have become omnipresent. We are overwhelmed. And with the evolution of digital culture, what happened is that we started perceiving almost the entire world through our eyes. We spent, days at work in front of our screen, then we switched to phones for leisure, entertainment, all these kind of things. So, out of 5 or 6 or 7 senses that we have as humans, we're, I would say, loosely relying 90% on visuals. And because the whole world is trying to sell you something, the world of visuals has been colonized by, the progression of late-stage capitalism, to put it that way. It's a lot of shortcuts, so I could go on for hours going deeper into these topics, but I think, very quickly that's what's happening. That's what's happening, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting take. I do a lot of work with students that would be considered media studies. So a lot of the things that you're talking about are really interesting, and we probably could go on that. But we want to talk about that little thing that you have in the background at some point. So you mentioned Apple, right? And you seem to be somebody who is really on the experimental side. So this was one of the reasons why I was really interested in talking to you, because I usually don't really talk to artists in the true sense. I usually talk to engineers and people who are kind of working from the technical perspective. But I really wanted to kind of talk to you. But Apple is sort of a company that is really pushing spatial audio to consumers. Do you think that's something that's more of a hindrance, or is this helping you in being more experimental with your work?
I think that's a great question, and I think you know the answer, and I guess we would probably agree on that. I have a pretty fresh perspective on the world of spatial audio. I mean, I've I've been working with audio quite a lot as a creative director, as a film director, etc., etc. So I've been working with sound designers, and sometimes spatial sound. But as a newcomer to spatial sound industry, if there is one, because we could argue about it, I see it very clearly that there are two streams. One is the consumer stream. Let's put it this way, and this is what Apple is doing. This is what Sony is doing, and all other companies bringing more and more gimmicks to essentially market better things which are still at crappy stereo with crappy headphones, and if we even worse quality these days through Bluetooth and all these kind of things. So there is this consumer thing which I don't believe has a lot of depth to it, because if you look at, like, if you compare the progress of what's happened in, let's say, in the visual world across years and compare it to what happened to the audio world, you could say that audio world is so much retarded in terms of the mainstream, right? We're still listening to MP3 formats, which were designed 20 or 30, 50 years ago. No, come on. What was, I'm getting too old. 30? 25?
Something like that, yeah. I'm not going to commit to a number because that kind of is probably embarrassing. But
a quarter of a century, right?
Yeah, at least.
And, since that time, the quality has only gotten worse. They brought us Bluetooth, which is still crappy. And, every other pair of headphones you get are worse and worse. And, well, somehow there are still new gimmicks, which don't really drive things forward. So I'm fairly critical about the consumer audio side of things. But at the same time, you have the second stream, which has always been there, which is, things happening on the edge, on the forefront, things which were pioneered by IEM, by Centre Pompidou and IRCAM, and researchers all over the world, and crazy things has been happening and crazy research, and these are like two entirely different worlds, right? Like, if you look at the world of computers or cameras, it's not that a consumer camera is like ages apart from a professional camera. It's the same technology. And in audio, that's not the case. Like, we have things like that. We have things like Dolby Atmos. We have, crazy spatial sound systems. We have things like the Sphere recently. And these are really cutting edge developments. I truly mean it. I'm against buzzwords, but I truly mean it. And at the same time, what you have on the consumer side is just, so substandard compared to what's possible. So there are these two avenues, and there is a huge gap in the middle. That's how I see the industry.
And so you're interested sort of in filling that gap to some extent, kind of bringing those things together?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
So where do you see yourself? On which side do you see yourself of that gap?
Oh, definitely not on the consumer side, and definitely not so much on the pioneering crazy research. Yeah, you nailed it. Maybe somewhere in the middle, right?
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, could be.
Now, when we started talking, one of the first plans was for me to actually come over to your place. It unfortunately didn't happen, but we might make that happen next year. There's just so many things going on here where I am that I was not able to do that. But I'm really fascinated also by the space in which you are in. And you talk a lot about this idea of social listening as using architecture as a collaborator, and you can actually see that in everything that you do. All the images are kind of very architectural, and the technology that you're using also kind of uses architecture as a component in your audio installation or in your technologies. So can you explain a little kind of how you think about this combination or this relationship between what you're doing and the architecture in which these installations are?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, where does it come from? I'm a kind of a guy that often reflects on what I'm doing and trying to find the common threads between all the crazy things that I've been doing in my life. And one of the conclusions I had was that, my artistry has to do a lot with space. And, as a filmmaker, I explored spatial aspects of things even more than, I used to do crazy 3D, used LiDAR, laser scanning in film, decade and something ago, which was very innovative. And, I was always interested in the spatial aspect of things, even if I capture them on flat screen ultimately, more so than like linear storytelling. So I think I've got it in my blood. Actually, I was supposed to study architecture, but I retreated or escaped. I studied culture, and but I've been a designer all my life, and I've been an architect. I used to design things like this house, for example. So architecture and space and understanding and being in space is just flows in my blood. And when I play music, like I play woodwinds, not professionally, but I love it. And when I work with sound, I've always been interested in spatial aspect. Like linearity is not my thing; it's boring, right? So if not linear, then it's spatial. I think that's the relationship. And going into like, okay, right now I'm working on these spatial sound instruments, singing watermelons, which is a good name actually because it makes people smile.
It does. It does.
And the whole point is, that it's against the grain again, because when you look at the entire professional audio industry, meaning mixing, producing, mastering, sound engineering, and all these kind of things, it always used to be like that space was an enemy, was a hidden or unspoken enemy. And, if you wanted to make a good reference sound, good studio for mixing or mastering, you needed to kill all the reflections and do proper acoustic treatment and all these kind of things, and, perfect speakers positioning and dealing with modes and all these kind of things, which is, from an engineering standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, and you're chasing this reference sound, which makes sense, right? And at the same time, this is something that has been fueling the commercial audio or hi-fi industry, because these guys get really crazy about the reference sound and, spending hundreds of millions of euros sometimes on crazy systems chasing this idea of reference sound, which is bullshit essentially. But anyways, it's all about losing that space, like forgetting about it, making it disappear, and being only in touch with the music and the speakers. But that's not how we perceive sound, and that's just chasing a holy grail. That's chasing something that's impossible. And of course, we have come a long way. Like if you buy a good pair of studio monitors these days, put some work into, adapting acoustically your studio, we have decent conditions to work with sound, right? But at the same time, we're still ignoring the fact that as humans, we perceive space through sound, and we perceive sound spatially. And to make it a little bit more substantial, right? One of the things I've done in my life was dancing, and like I really mean it. I spent like 10 years of my life dancing 5-6 hours a day. And one thing that I realized, that I learned, was that it's not as much like seeing the sense of sight, which is helping you orient in space, as much it is listening. Like we orient ourselves in space and we understand space through listening, like almost like bats. Like of course we don't do it in just in ultra high frequencies, right? But we hear spatially, and we hear space. And the whole thing with watermelons is that, it's like breaking this illusion. Like it's very honest. It's changing the paradigm. It's not something that I can take credit for, because this is something that started bubbling up 25 or something like that years ago at IRCAM, and then there was this whole project led by Franz Soder at IEM, where they explored that and they actually discovered these things, right? That it's about listening to space, and that with beamforming, particularly, what we're listening to is we're listening to space. We're listening to sound which is reflected of the space around and shaped by the space. And that's something that appeals to me a lot. And the reason for that is, first, it's true. Second, it's honest. We're not trying to pretend the space doesn't exist, or not trying to make it disappear. And lastly, just to conclude it and wrap my long rant, you mentioned you perceive me more as an artist, as an engineer, and I think there is a lot to it, because from the engineering standpoint, you're seeking perfection, clarity, and perfectly ideal conditions and transparency in sound and all these kind of things. Whereas from the artist perspective, we like to work with everything we have. Like, if it's not perfect, then it's great, right? If we hear space, let's use it as a means of expression. Let's try to tell something with it, and make it part of the game, make it a means of expression again, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that, and there are a couple of things actually I want to throw in here. Well, the first thing is that you're absolutely right. Sort of the artist is the process is a lot more messy, right? So an engineer is very focused, hyper focused on one particular thing, and it needs to be perfect, right? So you are really, as an artist, more interested in exploring the possibilities, and that when I see somebody, and we talked about that, who did so many different things, I immediately know that is more of an artist's mind, because they are trying to explore different things, and look how things are working together, and how they are really changing how we perceive sound, how we perceive space. So that's an interesting thought that you put out there. I would also say that I actually I'm really interested in the way you actually look at what your watermelon is really, and it's a nice name. I'm not quite sure if it's something that you deliberately did, or if it's something that just came out of this article from Sounding Futures. But it is a nice name. But I have a couple of PhD students who are working in similar areas. We're trying to be very artist-oriented in our PhD, so it's not really a hardcore science PhD. It's more artist. And I have one PhD student who did something that he called sound sponges. That was sort of the idea that you're creating architectural components in a space that essentially take sound away, in order to make things more quiet, in order to create more a less busy environment in terms of sound. And I have another PhD student who is looking at how jewelry influences sound. So essentially making ear jewelry that influences how you actually perceive the sound.
Wow.
And that's interesting. I think there are just so many possibilities for people to do something meaningful in that space that is completely underexplored, because everybody looks at this perfectionism.
Exactly.
and trying to do things in exactly the correct, whatever that means, way, right? So that's really something. Now, we already talked a couple of times about your watermelon, and it's the thing behind you, right? So let's talk
Right.
about that a little. What is that, and how would you describe what the purpose of that instrument? I think you call it an instrument. What that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, first of all, why singing watermelons? I like taking things against the grain, and it happens so that I spent a good chunk of my life professionally working in marketing and branding and brand strategy and all these kind of things. And I have a lot of thoughts about where the branding has come. And in a nutshell, long story short, I do believe, and I have plenty of thoughts on why branding is dying, or has has died already to some extent. And by when I start a new business, I of course think about the brand, and I wanted to keep it very casual, and I wanted to do an anti-brand, meaning not pretend we're like Apple, like Sony, we're impersonal, we are corporate, and all these kind of things. No, let's do it absolutely the opposite way, and let's do it casually. Like, let's break this illusion and of, like, because ultimately branding is about building and emphasizing gap between you and the brand, right? And that's not what I'm interested in. The reason I'm doing this project is, first of all, I was following my own curiosity and ambition. Perhaps I just wanted to learn how to do these things, how this works, and there is no better way to learn it than by doing it. But I also do it because I do believe that this is something that is absolutely fucking mind-blowing, and more people should play with this, whether they are musicians, sound designers, composers, whoever is interested in sound. There is no reason to be stuck in stereo and fight the stupid war, trying to make a career in the age of Spotify, right? Like, we know all that, right? All the madness. This is such an overcrowded field, and that's the reason I want to bridge that gap. I don't want to play the exclusivity game. I want to play the inclusivity game, right? And in a nutshell, after I have built the first prototypes that started to work, I thought, okay, there was Eco, and that has been a huge development. There has been almost entire career of Franz Soter and the team on it. They worked on for almost 2 decades on it, right? But 10 years later, or 7 years later, after the project has become somewhat commercialized, meaning the prototype was done and the instrument was done, right? Guess what? There is maybe 20 of these instruments existing in the world, and there is only one Eco and maybe a small 393, right? Like, it's still a very, very closed project, something that hasn't made an impact on the world. I mean, there is a bunch of institutions that know about it, a bunch of probably the same institutions that own one, and maybe a few dozens of lucky artists that have residency that allows them to spend some time with this instrument. But it doesn't have to be like that. Like, these things are not ridiculously expensive. There is no reason for it to be ridiculously expensive. And I think the next step is to make it more accessible, because it's cool and it's a great time to make a career in spatial sound using,
absolutely.
For example, this instrument.
Yeah. So before we get into the sort of accessibility, because you have a couple of different options for that watermelon. By the way, it's also a fruit, right? I mean, it's sort of apple and watermelon, kind of both are fruit. So the watermelon is the bigger fruit, though. So. For those of our viewers who have no idea what we're talking about, can you maybe explain what exactly your watermelon does? Why is it singing, and how is it used in a artistic environment?
Okay, so first of all, it's not a watermelon. Like, you cannot really eat it, and it's not very juicy. It's hollow. Well, we have a dampening substance inside, but that's not edible. It's not a burger. Is it singing? I don't think so. I think it's screaming more than singing. But actually, I had recently a guest coming from Germany who is a professional singer, and we did put some vocals on it, so it was singing. But anyways, it's a spatial sound instrument, and the simplest way to explain it, the way I like to explain it, is that imagine you have a lighthouse of sound. So the same way as a lighthouse on the coast sweeps the horizon with beams of light, the same principle applies here, meaning it's a very precise, directional spatial sound instrument. So, this version which stands behind me, it's 24 discrete channels, and with all the algorithms that are used to control it, it allows for very precise focus of sound beam and building the kind of thing that people refer to as sound sculptures. So, if you think about the speciality of sound, the very first thing that happened was mono sound, just one source, which is maybe directional, maybe omnidirectional, but there is no spatial definition. Then we have stereo, and we're made to believe that stereo is the thing that renders the whole stage and positioning, which is not true. It gives you an illusion of that, and we learned to accept this illusion as something that works, and it's a certain aesthetic kind of standard and cognitive pattern that we all follow. And beyond that, you have systems which were not very popular, like Quadro. It was bigger in 70s, 80s, right? But it has never made it to the mainstream. And then people are probably familiar with ambisonic domes or surround domes, meaning systems where you have a large amount of speakers positioned on a dome, so in a circle or in a bunch of circles, which allow for shaping sound more precisely, meaning it allows for shaping sound field and making it more spatial, right? But the whole point, the whole problem with this system is that you have to sit in the hotspot in the very middle, exactly in the same distance from every single speaker. And of course, it needs to be in an acoustically treated room. And if all these conditions are there and you're playing good stuff on it, maybe you can hear, yes, it's spatial. I'm hearing these things here, these things there, etc., etc. And some of these get like pretty decent resolution. And what Watermelon does is actually turning this idea inside out, right? So instead of having a bunch of speakers projecting towards the hotspot in the center, it's a central speaker projecting beams onto the walls, onto the surrounding space, and then filling the space with sound field, which bounces, of the architecture and comes back at your ears.
So you have not only, the one that you have in the back is, you said 24?
24.
24 speakers, but you have multiple versions, right? And people can actually purchase that. Is that correct?
Yes. I have designed an entire family of these. So the smallest you can get is actually 16. And 16 is what Stefan Riedel at IEM, a rebellious student at IEM, going against the grain and against all the professors and people higher in the hierarchy, went against them and designed this whole thing, trying to prove that it's possible to do it on a super small budget with super small speakers and not with 20, because Eco was 20, but with 16. And he did a lot of smart design to prove it works. So 16 is something I consider a minimum for making beamforming and sufficient spatial resolution. There are other developments which provide 12, and I do have versions with 12 designed. But for beamforming, it's a little bit insufficient. There is a project called AudioDice in Canada, and they did something like that with 12 speakers. Never achieved beamforming level, but they used it as 12 discrete channels in one speaker. So it gives you some spatiality, but it's not comparable to what you get with these guys. And so what was the question?
Well, the
family,
question,
okay.
There's an entire family, right? So
Yeah.
if I want to, essentially, if I'm interested in this technology, right? How do I decide which kind of member of the family I get?
Okay, that depends on a couple of things. Like The smallest one is my upgrade of the 393 that I mentioned, designed by Stefan Riedel. It's let's say a commercialized version, and I essentially, when I was learning how to do these things and how these things work. Of course, the first thing I did was building his design, like replicating it and learning from that. And then I went a step further and made some improvements, meaning I changed the enclosure, and it's a little bit different production technology. It's unibody, not coming from two basically 3D printed hemispheres. It's like one sphere done using industrial process, and it has gotten rid of a lot of ugly resonances that were in this small thing. So that's the smallest one, 16 channels, and it's like 20 something centimeters. And then they go up, like in the number of speakers and in the size. And which one you need or which one you want depends on two factors. First of all, what do you need it for? Like, is portability a thing for you? Because it's not only about carrying the speaker and its weight, it's also about the amplifiers for that, right? Because you need a decent rack to power it, because you need 16 or 24 channels. So at minimum, this is 3 rack units, plus you need an interface and digital analog converters. So it's quite a rack. And yeah, the small 393 can be really portable and could be thought of as a personal spatial sound instrument, and that's how people use it. But it's still quite potent. Whereas the big guys, my largest model, which is actually this one, I'm just about to put it together. This will be something around 50-60 kilograms. It's 56 centimeters diameter, 6.5-inch speakers, 24 of them. So it's quite beefy.
So the best way to kind of find out probably is just get in touch with you and kind of talk to you about what the purpose is, and then
we did a small of course, this is not like buying a new set of earpods, right? It's more like buying an instrument for yourself, whether it's a double bass or saxophone or piano, right? You know something about it, you know something about spatial sound, probably you have already worked with spatial audio. You're getting aware of it, maybe you listen to it somewhere or to a similar instrument, you start exploring, you come over, we have a demo, or you meet me at one of the events, and and then we listen and we see what works for you. I tried to make it a little bit easier, like on Slovok's website there is a small quiz or an interactive process that allows you to find an instrument for yourself, meaning given your budget and your priorities in terms of like precision, power, portability, and budget, we will suggest the best instrument automatically.
Now, I'd like to go back a little to the technology, because you mentioned a couple of times that what you're doing is heavily influenced by research from a number of people. IEM came up a lot. And you also talked about the idea of beamforming, and that this thing is more like something like a lighthouse of sound. That's sort of the way you phrased it.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little how the research influenced the technology? And kind of one thing that I'm also really interested in is if you could kind of explain a little how the beamforming, how does somebody have to kind of think about what that actually means? Does it sort of mean that when I'm coming in that space that I hear the sound very directional in a very specific way? And how do you manage to get because sound kind of distributes in all kinds of directions, right? So how do you actually utilize the research that has been done in that area in order to kind of get that beamforming impression?
Right. So that's a lot of questions.
That's a loaded one. And
okay.
kind of if there's certain things that you don't want to talk about because they are kind of company secret, that's fine too. But I'm just curious.
No secrets here. Absolutely no secrets here. And this project wouldn't be possible without me basing a lot of work on what has been provided in an open source way via research, which is publicly available. When it comes to beamforming technology, I haven't incremented significantly over the work at IEM, so it's still the same technology, same principles. My focus has been primarily on changing, like learning how to do it, how to replicate it, and trying to make it more affordable by applying my design knowledge and my design thinking and experience to make the enclosures and the form factor a little bit more scalable, affordable, and less cumbersome, right? Because the thing is, like the original Eco is an icosahedron, which is a platonic solid. But the whole thing about it is that, okay, it's made out of triangles, and there is only 20 triangles. If you want a smaller version, I think it's dodeca, which is 12. Or there are much larger platonic solids, which have something like 60. So not much use for these. So the first problem that I wanted to tackle was, okay, how do you go, why 20? 20 doesn't make any sense because usually channels are bundled in 4s or 8. 20 is not a nice round number. Doesn't make much sense. So, of course, I wanted to utilize a sphere, and a large chunk of my approach was to design a system. Actually, I approached it parametrically. So currently I do have a program, a CAD program, where all the designs of the entire family are parametrized, meaning I can insert the driver dimensions, the number of drivers, the layout, and actually in a matter of like 2 or 3 clicks, the entire manufacturable enclosure design is spit out. And, of course, there is a lot of manual tweaking afterwards, and you need to prepare it for the manufacturing process and, well, assess whether it's viable or not, right? But it's parametric, and it's because of the focus on abandoning the icosahedron and making it work on a sphere. But this doesn't answer your question, because the question was, how is it based on the IEM research, right? So it's 100% based on IEM research and the work of Franz and Stefan and the team over there.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because you obviously start with platonic solids, right? So icosahedron, dodecahedron, and those, and to position points equidistant on a sphere is actually not a non-trivial problem. This is actually one of the things that I started out as an academic. I actually started out in an institute for geometry, really, and so kind of I kind of spent my first 10 years as an academic with dodecahedron. Yeah, so I kind of it's really interesting. I think that's really one of the, at least the way I see it, as one of the innovations, that you actually have this flexibility. You build that flexibility into the system that allows you to have an entire family of things, right? It's not just kind of one. You have an entire family, and you can scale that to an extent. I think that's actually super interesting. Now, let's say I'm an artist and I have one of your devices, right? So how does this work? How do I work with that system? Because my understanding is that you also want to have some interaction with the architecture, and that means the placement of the instrument makes the difference. And so in the creative process, when an artist works with that, the artist also needs to think about how that instrument is located in space and how does it interact with the environment. So how can they think of that? How does that process work, working with the singing watermelon?
Right. It's a good question, and so I'll try to answer it, and at the same time I'll try to go back to beamforming, which you asked about, and I didn't really unpack it. So let's talk about directionality first, and let's try to compare this to existing and established systems like ambisonics. So first of all, let's get some basics. I'm sure your audience is well educated and they know it. But generally, as you progress through the spectrum of sound and frequencies, you have different directionality. So if you look at sounds which are in very, very high frequency range, like 10, 15, 20 kilohertz, they are super precisely directional. If you have sounds which are in the mid-range, let's say 1000, 2000 hertz in frequency, they are still directional, but getting less and less. And then when you transition to bass frequencies and bass and lower end of spectrum, because of the physics and acoustics, the sound becomes less and less directional. And when you consider sub-bass range, the domain of subwoofers, no matter what you do, the sound is always omnidirectional, meaning there is no directionality. Of course, you have some phasing issues and things like, people would play with positioning of subwoofers in concerts or in venues, or, there is a lot to know about it, but it's not about making it directional, it's about getting rid of artifacts. But there is no way to make something like 16 hertz directional. But the whole thing is that, between, let's say, 50 hertz all the way to 400 or 500 or all the way up, there is a way to make low frequencies directional. And this is exactly what beamforming achieves. And when you think about ambisonic systems, the way the panning and positioning of sound is done is usually by all-rad, which is essentially amplitude-based panning, meaning you put more amplitude on this speaker and less amplitude on this, and maybe you crossfade between them, or blend between the power of the amplitude on two speakers, right? And this is something that works for high frequencies, but it doesn't really work for lower frequencies. And this is where beamforming is much superior compared to what's possible with ambisonics, even if you have a lot of speakers. So that's why beamforming is probably one of the most sophisticated and precise and directionally rich algorithms or approaches, right? And this is exactly what drove my fascination with it, because once I heard it, I knew that this is something that, like, now we're talking, right? It's so much different to ambisonic domes. And so this is my obsession, and this is something that was probably driving Franz through the years of his research, and something that was a holy grail. However, I'm learning a lot across this project, because the first thing I learned is that, what is my obsession and the whole thing about like super precise directivity is not necessarily how people want to use these instruments. And this drives back to the question of how do we want to use space with this, right? So currently I'm thinking about it in a very, very open way. And this is also what differentiates this project from the work that has been done at IEM and ECO, because ECO was always thought of as a beamformer and designed that way, and that's how people use it. And there is also the entire school of thinking in terms of using it in conjunction with architecture, exploring sound and space and intersections of sound and space. And it's great, it's fascinating, but it's not for everyone. And this instrument gives you much, much more capability and possibilities, because you can use it as a beamformer, you can use it as a super high resolution ambisonic instrument, you can use it as 24 or 20 or 16 discrete channels, which you can, play the way you like, use it very creatively. You could maybe split it into a quadro system or into stereo or into a bunch of stereos, or you can get 5 of this in a room and do some other crazy stuff with it. And as I chatted with a lot of professionals in the industry, guys from Canada, and people that worked with Eco and other sound designers and artists, I very quickly realized that when people get access to spatial sound instruments in general or spatial sound systems, they don't necessarily want to use it by the book. And I remain open to that. And I think that, it is what it is. It's a bunch of speakers, and there is a range of possibilities of how to use them. You're an artist, go figure it out. And, people do absolutely amazing stuff with sound these days. They have brilliant ideas. They explore very, very different approaches technically and artistically. So I don't want my way of thinking and the heritage taken from, created by people who worked on the prototypes and on this technology before me. I don't want to impose it over people, right?
Is there any specific software that people need in order to get that beamforming? Is this something that you provide, or how does this work? Or is it do you just need like Reaper and kind of a DAW that has enough channels and work with that and kind of just feed in higher order ambisonics and kind of it comes out there?
Just Reaper. I like the way you phrased it. The thing is, we're getting probably a bit insider perspective on it, right? So first of all, there is a lot of people who do great things with sound and they are not aware of Reaper and they haven't worked with spatial sound. Or maybe they try spatial sound but using Ableton and maybe things like envelope, right?
An envelope, yeah.
Envelope,
I have, and by the way, kind of quite honestly, if people who are watching this do not know Reaper, you guys are in the wrong video. It's sort of Reaper is sort of a must have.
Yeah.
Audio, really.
Okay, so to get the most out of beamforming, of course, and generally spatial sound, you need Reaper. The other alternative is doing like hardcore programming in Max MSP, or if you're a good programmer, you can use any platform or Super Collider or whatever, and do some crazy programming stuff and use the full power of this instrument. On the other side, it is possible to there's 24 channels here. You can imagine you have 12 people running a stereo setup using Ableton Live, and each of them taking 2 speakers out of the beamformer. This is actually something which was inspired by one of the prospects I talked to, who actually wanted to use it for their laptop orchestra or something like that. Interesting, right? So there are, 2 different sides of the story. The most sophisticated, most technologically advanced way. This is Max MSP plus Reaper, plus a bunch of spatialization plugins that you prefer. A good free setup coming from IEM is enough to start. And then there is a set of quite sophisticated filters, which are essentially based on convolution, like multi-layer, multi-channel convolution, that do all the crazy maths which is required to make it work. So for an artist, you get your DAW, ideally a Reaper, and then you do your spatialization magic, and then on top of that, you are feeding this signal into encoding into higher order ambisonic, and then from there our decoders.
Then decoding with your decoders into something that can play back, and obviously there's sort of a separate decoder for each of your instruments, kind of within your family.
Exactly.
One thing that this reminds me of is the more I think about that, is sort of the sound equivalent to projection mapping, right? To some extent, right? If you think about that,
yes.
And I was just wondering if there are any people out there who use it that way, because my feeling is that if you do, if you think about projection mapping, in case people don't know what it is, it's sort of the idea that you project something onto a building, and then essentially the building, people have seen that we're building kind of do all kinds of crazy things based on the projection that put on them. But if you create a projection mapping installation, you actually have to feed the architecture or the geometry into a particular piece of software that then calculates what's actually being projected on. So I'm kind of curious if there are people who have used it in a similar way, that looked at the geometry of the space in which this instrument is going to be placed, and then tried to kind of create a particular impression based that is sort of taking the geometry of the space into account, similar to a projection mapping approach, if that makes sense. Are there any people who
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
used it
yeah,
that
yeah.
way, or can?
Well, it's a good question. Let me answer indirectly. Technically, yes, you could say that these processes are similar. Practically, once you start working with this sort of instruments, you realize that there is no way to ignore space. And you realize how much the space influences what's happening. Like, really, when I composed the first piece for my watermelon, I had it sitting somewhere there. And even if I move it in a room 5 meters across and put it in a corner, I have a lower ceiling in this part of house. The effect, that the kind of like sound sculpture that comes out of that, and the entire impression is so much different that it makes you think, because all of a sudden it's not the same way of thinking as you do using it's exactly the opposite of traditional mixing and mastering, because you do your mixing, meaning, okay, you try to nail the generally acceptable good sounding mix, and of course you're listening to on a good stereo monitors, but you do a comparison on crappy headphones, and maybe on a laptop you adjust so that it plays well everywhere. But your goal is to make it sound more or less the same everywhere. And with this, the principle is exactly different, meaning you very quickly realize that it's all about the space, and you start discovering spatial aspect of sound, meaning how the sound interacts in space with the architecture, and there is no way to ignore it. And then, well, it's up to you how you use it creatively. So you cannot even say that this instrument sounds in a specific way. No, it always sounds in a specific way in a specific space, right? You move it 5 meters away, it's different. You move it to an entirely different space, it's very different.
The thing that kind of and kind of I wouldn't necessarily say an engineering background, but I come from a very technical background. So the obvious question for me always is, can I reverse engineer what I'm going to see, right? So if I know the geometry, can I create something that fits that particular geometry in a very particular way, so that as an artist I can create a particular impression? Or is it more something that is just try and error, that kind of I kind of see how it sounds and then kind of make changes to the way I've composed my music or whatever, and then kind of adjust everything in order to get a particular impression? Or is there a way to actually pre-calculate that, to kind of reverse engineer what's going to come out at the end?
Well, humans have a very good reverse engineering mechanism, and it's called intuition, right? So you start working with these things, and you sort of kind of expect very quickly what will it sound like, right? Maybe you'll get surprised once in a while, but generally you know what works, what doesn't. You know what works, what doesn't compositionally within the realm of your composition and your style, and you know what sort of things you could expect from the architecture. But again, there is no right way of doing that. I don't think it's about chasing any sort of like reference or correctness or anything like that. I've like looking at what people do with Eco, with 393, and with other spatial sound systems, because there is not so many composers or sound designers working with spatial sound. It's a fairly small pack of people. Actually, after a while, everybody knows each other. But what I notice is that like pretty much everybody is using these things very differently. And if you ask me what is that technically necessary to make sense out of this instrument, I would say never put it in a huge reverberant room with like very very long tail, because it just doesn't make sense. And I've seen people doing exactly that, putting this instrument in large halls of modern architecture. By the way, that was done at IEM at the last festival in July, and playing ambient, right, where the kind of like the directionality collapses entirely. And if I like transients which boost this directionality and make you aware and give you an elevated sense of spatial awareness or perception, people do absolutely different things, and that's still okay. That's exploration, and I think this is wonderful, right?
I like the way you framed that intuition is the best kind of how do they say that intuition sort of is that humans are good in reverse engineering, and it's the intuition.
It's called intuition. Yeah.
It's called intuition. I like that. I'm going to kind of borrow that at some point, because it's absolutely true. And kind of we come back to how we started the discussion, kind of technical versus artist mind, right? In that sense that the artistic process is messy, and it is a design process. So it is a result of iteration and becoming aware of what the technology can do, and not so much trying to figure out the exact way on how to do that. I really.
Well, if you look at Musique Concrète and the tradition of Acousmonium, this is exactly what they were doing, right? These guys are still, creating compositions and listening to compositions on a bunch of totally unrelated technically speakers. Like they put an entire variety of speakers in a room, and they fit them with signals, and sometimes they are clashing, sometimes they are interacting in a very unpredictable way with each other and with the space. And there's a whole movement to it, and a lot of interesting things happening there, right? So there are no correct ways. That's the beauty of the world of art.
That's kind of very well said. That's very well said. Now, if somebody wants to listen to that device, how can they experience the Singing Watermelon? What's the best way to kind of do that? Are there any events where they can kind of talk to you? Is there any other way to get in touch with you in order to experience that?
Yeah, generally I'm at a very nice place with this business where I'm not crazy busy. I'm not overwhelmed. This is a small scale business and small scale undertaking, and it means I have time and I have availability. And if people are interested, they can reach out to me. We can chat. I'm receiving guests here where I am, and sometimes I'm giving private demos over a weekend. Usually like one heavily packed day is sufficient to get a good understanding of what the instrument is capable of. And I had artists coming, and we were trying out different things from live improvisation, adapting some pop songs and trying to make them sound good on this instrument just to see what's possible, adapting quickly some of their compositions or sound design works or other things. And you do 5 or 7 sessions, like micro sessions, micro tasks like that a day. You're exhausted at the end of the day, but you get a sense of like what the possibilities are. You are overwhelmed, your mind is blown, and then you think what to do next. So that's doable. A while ago I did an open call for collaborations with artists, generously offering a week-long workshop here with me and the instrument, and a couple of weekend sessions. And this is something I'm going to keep doing, and these sessions will be scattered all over the year. But regardless of that open call, if you as an artist have a good idea of what would you like to do, maybe you have a project in mind, I'm open for collaborations, and we can figure something out.
And just to be clear where here is, because you are located on the German-Polish border on the Polish side, if I'm...
Yeah, almost. So generally, my life headquarters have been in Wrocław or Breslau for German-speaking people, which is a past German, formerly German city, currently Polish, one of the largest cities in Poland, and is southwest Poland. So it's like 3 hours away from Berlin. And that's where my life headquarters have always been, and my studio and my companies. But a couple of years ago, I moved out of the city, and I live about 100 kilometers to the west, on a hill full of oaks with raccoons and birds, and there is nothing here, pristine nature. But it's closer to Berlin. It's like 2.5 hours by car, something like that. So it's definitely reachable by car. With some arrangements, it's also reachable by a combination of plane, train, and I could even pick people up from the train station. That's what I sometimes do. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
It's all doable.
As I said before, we started this discussion by kind of me getting really interested and finding a way to actually visit you. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen this year, but we definitely need to do that.
Let's make it happen.
Let's make that happen and make like a follow-up video to this one that is sort of on location, because I'm really interested in your technology, because that is really cool. I think it's one of the more innovative things that I've seen, and I really like what you're doing. Well, I mean, I think we covered almost everything that we wanted to talk about. Is there anything that we missed? Is there anything that you want to kind of add that we didn't touch?
Yeah, definitely. I'd like your take on what's happening in spatial audio or spatial sound industry, and how do you see that?
That's an interesting.
Besides of all the great software developments that you're covering on your podcast.
Well, that's an interesting one, because I think kind of what you said at the very beginning kind of gave me a lot of kind of thoughts, because there is a lot of branding and marketing going on where kind of the use of immersive and spatial audio is highly commercialized and really kind of just made as something that is just for the purpose of kind of selling things. I just got the new Bose headphones, and they claim immersive audio, but actually I have no clue why that's called immersive. There's nothing to do with immersive audio. It's just kind of something that's on the box. So in that sense, I think there is this commercial tendency to monetize, let's call it that way, to monetize the idea of spatial audio. And the reason this is something that companies are looking into is simply because everybody understands that immersive media is going to become more and more important as we move forward, right? So we just need to think about virtual reality devices, augmented reality devices, and those all need immersive audio. So everybody understands that's going to be something that's going to be important in the future, but nobody has really figured out how to do that in a way that is interesting and innovative. So kind of there's this commercial side. I'm not so deeply invested in the artistic side, because that's not necessarily something that I do. But I think there's a lot of potential there for people who want to experiment with that technology and do something that is sort of orthogonal to what the industry is doing, right? So your device, your instrument, sort of really questions what immersive audio, what spatial audio is supposed to be, because you're sort of really inverting the entire idea. Because everybody is just thinking about kind of having like hundreds of speakers around you, and then kind of having this dome or a Dolby Atmos system, and having a 9.1.6 and a 22.2 speaker system, but everything is sort of as in this dome structure, whereas you're kind of really inverting that idea. And I think that is just not explored enough. So when students usually come to me with research projects that try to play with this idea, as I said a little bit earlier, the idea of sound sponges, for example, right? That you use architecture in order to tackle the problem of sound pollution in cities, for example, right? I think there's just so much. Let me put it that way. Once I got a little bit into that space, I started to understand that there is so much there that people can think and research and do and innovate that is completely underexplored, in my opinion. And so kind of anything, whenever I see something like what you're doing, I get really excited because sort of that to me is really the future of where we should go with immersive audio. Right. So I kind of now I spoke kind of a very long time, but I hope.
Nah, come on. You're not even at 5% of what I spoke.
Well, but sort of I'm interviewing you, right? So in that sense, that is expected, right? So
look, I think that let me throw a different perspective at the end. Maybe that will be inspiring for the listeners and also for you, and for me, it always has been inspiring to think about these things. So to me, the problem is not about the technology. And I would say that, building a watermelon or building another this or that device that does something, it's a piece of cake, actually. The real problem, especially in spatial audio industry, is that we have no established social ways of experiencing that. And this is the problem, that if you look at how numerous generations of innovators failed with virtual reality, that's exactly this problem. Because I remember in the early 90s, there was Doom 2, and there was a VFX1, or what was that? I can't remember the name, but there was an early virtual reality headset which used two 486 computers to play 320 by 200 Doom or Frankenstein on the goggles, right? And that was the first VR thing, and it worked actually, but it never caught on. And then, roll over to 2015, and there was Oculus Rift 2 and the whole revival of virtual reality again. And there were technological developments done, and there was progress. However, it never took off, right? And roll forward another decade, and you have Apple failing so heavily, trying to deploy this, what was this, Vision Pro, right? Or what was that? Spatial computing or whatever, right? Which is essentially the same thing, which is a merger of VR and augmented reality headset. And it just doesn't work, right? And the world is still listening to music through stereo, and people are listening to crappy music in crappy bars where the audio system doesn't really matter because the architecture is so fucking badly designed that nobody cares about how the space will sound. And, there is huge amount of ignorance we have to deal with, as you said, with respect to how we shape the sound environment around us. And it's not only sound pollution, the same goes for light pollution, right? But let's focus on sound. So we keep ignoring how spaces sound, right? You go to a hospital, it sounds shit. You go to a restaurant, it sounds shit. You go out and your head is blown because of so much noise, and you have to shout to, make people, a friend of yours sitting next to you, hear you, right, and understand you. So sound awareness is not existing in how architecture works these days. I mean, it's changing. Yes, we are putting some, acoustic treatments here and there, but it doesn't have a proper seat at the table. So that's one of the reasons, it's not about the technology as much as it's about social development and awareness and, making people aware that sound is important and it's more than stereo, et cetera, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And kind of, I think the way you kind of explained it, to say it has not the correct seat on the table, right? We said at the beginning, when you have a movie experience, whether it's 50% or more, kind of, but the majority of the experience is essentially sound. But with architecture, we are not really there yet. Now, I'm not an expert in architecture. We do have an architecture department in our college, so I need to be very careful what I'm saying because I have people around me who actually know this stuff. But sort of, at least from my perspective, from my understanding, it is not an equal component on the table.
Exactly.
That is right. So everything is still very visual, structural, but sort of how sound affects. Well, obviously with some exceptions, right? So if you're designing an acoustic space, obviously that's a different story. But in general, architecture it's not at the same. It's not considered at the same level. That's absolutely true.
Exactly. But I think there is, just to wrap the very last thought, I think there is a very promising ground opening up, and I'm curious if you agree with me. But what we're seeing is that there is more and more sound-oriented social listening spaces opening up. You have like sound bars, you have hi-fi or audiophile bars. I've seen people doing sound-related ceremonies, usually in round buildings, meaning these are like small domes or things like, or cabins or things like that, small social listening spaces where people would do meditation, mindfulness, guided meditation, things like that. A friend of mine is actually also doing a bit of spatial sound work, and he's a composer and an active musician, and he's actually playing ambient music sets using spatial sound where people can relax and enjoy spatial music, which is played live. And it's a social listening situation, meaning it's a small venue. They adapt existing rooms or they tour with it. So no sophisticated technology, but they create a new social context where we can experience sound in somewhat spatial form, which is going beyond the traditional established way of, okay, let's go to Dolby Atmos cinema, or let's listen to stereo on my headphones, or hi-fi on my stereo at home, right? And I do believe that this is exactly the direction where this kind of instruments and potentially other developments in the field will actually find, a courtyard to exist, right? A place to exist and be used for something other than, celebrating that we're at the cutting edge.
Yeah. I absolutely think that you are on the cutting edge, and kind of to wrap things up. I think if anybody is interested in how sound influences space, they definitely need to look at what you're doing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave all the links to the website and everything, and to your article on Sounding Futures, and also your contact information in the description, so that people can get into contact with you and maybe experience the singing watermelon themselves, or at least kind of start thinking about what they can do with it or what they could do with it to get in touch with you. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there that you opened up with your technology, and I really like the idea of this family of watermelons. That's
Thank you very much. I would also suggest keep your eyes and ears open to what's happening in spatial audio space, especially if you are in Germany, if you're in Berlin. There is a lot of things happening. You have Monom, which they have one of the first 4D sound systems. They are doing public events. There is a lot of great things happening over there. There is Space Lab and Gary Sharma and other people who are, let's say, veterans of working with ICO and exploring these sound sculpture things. They are doing events, and there is a lot of things that you could explore, which has been created by these people and these circles. And well, there are spatial sound festivals. There was another one in September, just organized by guys at Monom and 4D Sound team. So things are happening, and just keep your ears and eyes open. Go attend, listen to what works for you, get into spatial sound, experience these things by yourself, because there is no other alternative than going and listening to these systems live with good content on it.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very well said. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. This was really enlightening and very interesting. And best of luck for the future. And once again, we are going to probably do a second video, because I absolutely need to see these things in person and hear these things in person. Thank you again.
Let's do it. Thank you for having me, and well, thanks again.
Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions, drop them in the comment section below or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.